All right, so we're gonna get started, and just quick introduction. My name is Ming, and I was born in China, grew up here in the U.S., and my wife Lily, and I came to Willcrest Baptist about a year ago. So today we're gonna give you, or I'm gonna give you a quick history about Christianity in China. So first of all, I'm gonna ask you guys a question, and don't worry about being politically correct or offending anyone. So the question is, what do you think of when you think of China? Anyone? Just shout it out. Technology? Sorry? Communism, that's right. That's right. Lots of people. Great Wall. Anybody's worried about this trade war? So actually there's a lot of perceptions about a place, and let me give you some historical perspectives. This is in the 1800s, and a lot of people have different perceptions about China. Some have ideas of financial opportunities. At that time, many imperial expansion opportunities. A lot of times, Asians were villainized, right? So that middle picture there, that's actually during the time in the 1800s. Actually, Chinese people are the only group of people that were legally excluded from entering the U.S. It's the Chinese Exclusion Act of the 1800s. So that picture was to villainize, Chinese people. They're, scary octopus, right? With all of these different problems like opium and immorality and things like that. So the reason I bring that up is sometimes you gotta be careful when you think the media or the society is telling you a certain group are villains. Right? There's usually a reason behind that. There were a lot of books and stories like Dr. Fu Manchu. It sounds like funny, right? But and Ming the Merciless. Do you guys know who he is? Right? Yeah, that's right. So it's like this. These Asians were at that time. People wanted to, you always want to pick a enemy, right? So you pick somebody and you kind of characterize them and make them your enemy. And you can kind of tell who your enemies are by watching the latest James Bond movie and whoever's the bad guy, right? That's who like our society is villainizing at that moment. So just to give you a little bit overview, very general information, 1.38 billion people as of 2015, I believe. I think India is catching up, but still China's number one. Yeah, and similar size to the US in terms of land, but with Alaska and Hawaii. Hawaii doesn't really contribute much to the landmass, but the US is bigger. There are 56 different ethnic groups in China, and that's recognized by the government. And so most Chinese people look like me. We're considered what's called Han, so ethnically Han. But there are also like Kazakhs. They're also a group within Western China, and Uyghurs. So some of them may look more European, actually, more like Middle Eastern. So not everybody looks like me, even though a lot of times people think, oh, all you Chinese people look alike. We think all, Caucasians look alike and all Africans look alike too. So it's normal. So China has over 3,000 years of written history. And so this map kind of shows you the different dynasties and how it progressed and expanded. For almost all of those 3,000 years, China was ruled by emperor. So there was somebody who, I don't know who said it, but they believe that they're the son of heaven, right? And they're mandated by heaven to rule over China. And sometimes there will be different groups saying, I'm the son of heaven, and another group say, we're supposed to be the son of heaven, and there's a lot of war. So over 3,000 years, China has been ruled by emperors. So that only changed in 1911. And so, I'll just let this Yuan dynasty actually was, there were a few dynasties where what were considered foreigners came and ruled. And Yuan dynasty was one of those. That's the Genghis Khan that you guys might be familiar with. So the official name of China is the People's Republic of China. And it's been under the control of the communists since 1949. And actually, there's two Chinas, right? There's the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China. So the People's Republic of China is the big red. When we were kids, we were taught that China looks like a big chicken, right? So it's a big chicken. And then there's a little thing that right there with the little blue. That's the Republic of China. That's Taiwan. Okay. So just so you know that there might be three types of people. When you see somebody who's Chinese, they may say I'm Chinese, or they may say I'm Chinese from Taiwan, or they may say I'm Taiwanese. Okay, and you can't confuse those because you'll offend somebody. If you say somebody who's Taiwanese and you say, oh, okay, you're Chinese, they may start a fight with you to say that I'm not Chinese, right? So we can talk about that in another time, or there's some questions later. Just to give you a kind of a breakdown of Christianity, I kind of split it up into 5 different times. So the early missionaries from the 7th century to the 1800s, and then the first Protestant missionaries during the Qing dynasty, which is the last dynasty, and then the warring times, so that's the 3rd, and then the 4th period is the closed communist China. So closed communist China is, if you think about North Korea right now, right? It's a closed country. And then finally modern China, so 1979 until the present. The earliest recorded missionaries came in the Tang dynasty in the 7th century. And these were the Nestorians from Persia. So that picture. There were cycles of persecution and acceptance. So once in a while, emperor may accept the foreign missionaries, and then the next emperor may change that policy completely and be massive persecution. And the Nestorians actually survived quite a long time, but there's very little records of them. Actually, even when Marco Polo came to China, he noticed that there were still Nestorians there. And Nestorians were actually the Christians from Persia that they came across the Silk Road. And they actually stole silkworms from China and smuggled them to Persia, and that's why you get the Persian silk, right? So then in the 16th century, by that time the Nestorians had all disappeared after the Yuan dynasty. The Jesuits came to China, and they were actually quite influential. So the Mateo Ricci is in this picture, in this drawing, sorry, okay. The first Protestant missionaries didn't come until the beginning of the 1800s. Robert Morrison, he came in 1907, and he was, as the first missionary, all by himself. If you can imagine, he faced so many different oppositions, including opposition from the existing Catholic groups. So that's also one of the disappointing things where Christians kind of fight among themselves and made life very difficult. And at that time, when he came to China, it was illegal to learn Chinese. It was illegal to share the gospel. So foreigners were limited to certain areas, so he couldn't even go anywhere. So he was actually kind of going crazy. He was terribly lonely. He didn't have enough food and money. He kept getting ripped off by others, and so he was just really struggling. It took him 7 years before he got this first convert. And later on, he got hired by the East Indian Company and it helped his problem a bit. He got a little bit more money, and he was able to do a bit more. And he published his first Bible in 1823, so the first Chinese Bible. And he also published a Chinese dictionary. Okay, and let's see, sorry. The Opium Wars. So what happened was many, especially the East India Company, they were coming to China to get a lot of the goods, but there was a huge trade deficit with China. Does that sound familiar to you guys? So there was a huge trade deficit, and then the British thought, what can we do? They thought, well, we could start importing opium to China. And so opium, I didn't put a chart up there, but opium sales in China grew like exponentially. And to the point where basically the opium sale was offsetting the entire trade deficit and getting more money from China. And at that point, there were some Chinese officials that were very upset and wanted to ban opium. So they kept the ships from importing. They kept them out in the harbor and wouldn't let them come in. And that's basically what started the Opium Wars. And basically, the Qing dynasty was not able to fight off the Western attackers and lost the Opium Wars. And it allowed more access to foreigners and actually allowed more access to many of the missionaries. Okay, so the first, just a timeline. So the first Protestant missionary, 1807, right? The first Christian cult. So this guy, his name is Hong Xiuqian, and he believed he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. And he had some dreams, and he started a whole rebellion. And this rebellion almost took over the government. That's how powerful it was. And later on, he was finally defeated. But that was the Taiping Rebellion. And the estimate is 30 to 30 million people died in that basically civil war. What happened next was the Boxer Rebellion. So there was a lot of problems during the Qing dynasty. Because of the foreign invaders, there were many Chinese that had this anti-foreign mentality. So there was a group called the Boxers, and they, not because they wear underwear on that, because they actually believed that martial arts, they had a special martial arts. If you watch old kung fu movies, sometimes you'll see these. But they believed that they are impervious to knives and swords, spears, even bullets, right? So they're super tough, and they went out and but they were going after Christians and foreigners. So they were kind of supported by the government because the government were a little bit anti-foreign as well. So they actually killed 30,000 Catholics, 2,000 Chinese Protestants, and 153 missionaries, including 53 children. They were later defeated by the Alliance of 8 Nations. So that picture is basically all the nations, the army of the different nations coming together. And at that time, actually, Taiwan was given to Japan. And actually, in the previous Opium War is where Hong Kong was given to Britain. So every time China loses a war, parts get split up to different countries. So that's the time period when Hudson Taylor, probably many people, if you've heard of him, he was in China. He came in 1854, and though there were many other denominations there, he quickly became very influential. He didn't just stay in the coastal cities, he went to inland, and he insisted on dressing and speaking like the locals. So even though everybody made fun of him, he insisted to be part of the local culture, right? So he spoke 4 different dialects in Chinese. He was able to preach in those dialects. So I can only speak one, right? So he learned these local dialects, and he during the Boxer Rebellion, out of the 153 missionaries that died, 58 of them were from his group, right, from the China Inland Missions, and 21 of the children were from China Inland Missions, and he was devastated by this. And while all the other foreigners were requiring reparations for everything, right, he refused any payment for those deaths. And as a result, he was highly respected by the Chinese, and they actually encouraged other missionaries to join the China Inland Missions. So many people heard about it and wanted to join. Right? Lottie Moon, so I think you guys are familiar with her. She is quite an amazing person. Her sister was the first single female missionary to go to China. They had found that although many men missionaries were very successful in sharing the Gospels with others, but they couldn't approach the women. So then there were many more women coming to China, and after Lottie Moon's sister Edmonia came to China, Lottie followed her the year later. What's special about Lottie was she was a prolific writer, and she would write all the time to the mission board requesting desperately needed support. She wrote to the Foreign Mission Journal and proposed that the week before Christmas be established for a time of giving to the foreign missions, right? So that's why we have the Lottie Moon Fund. She was in China during the time of a lot of wars, and even though she's continued to ask for support, desperately needed support, at that time, the mission board had gone bankrupt, so she wasn't getting any support. So she started sharing her own food, her own money with those around her. At the end, when other missionaries came and they saw her, she was only 50 pounds. And they said, you gotta go back. You need rest. You need to recover. She only made it to Japan, and then she passed away. So that was the second period. The third period is the warring time. So after the end of the Qing dynasty, this guy right here is considered the father of China, Sun Yat-sen, or in Chinese is Sun Zhongshan. And that guy, he's the last emperor of China. I don't know if you've seen the movie. He was 6 years old when he had to abdicate, and basically that was the end of the dynastic period. And following right after the founding of the Republic of China, there was a lot of different groups that wanted to take over China. There were a lot of warlords, and these two gentlemen kind of ended up as the two most powerful groups that ended up fighting. Anybody recognize this guy? Mao Zedong, and that's Chiang Kai-shek. It's very rare to have them in the same picture. They're like the arch nemesis. So Mao Zedong is basically the ultimate leader for the Communist Party, and Chiang Kai-shek is the Nationalist Party. Okay. Oops. Okay. So they started fighting, but then the Japanese invaded China. And that's the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War, which for the rest of the world is World War II, right? Even now, many Chinese still feel a lot of resentment for this war. Estimated 20 million Chinese people died, mostly civilians during this war. Oops. Right, okay, so Eric Liddell, anybody know who he is? Chariots of Fire, that's right. So he actually was born in China, but he's Scottish. And he won the 400 meters in the 1924 Olympics, even though he was supposed to run the 100, right? So you guys know the story. The 100 meter was on Sunday, and he refused to run on Sunday. It wasn't even the final, it was just a qualifying heat. He refused to run on Sunday because the day is reserved for the Lord and he had to preach. And so he ended up having to run the 400, which is a completely different race. But nevertheless, he won that race, and it's like history, right? And when, just so you know, like when he refused to run the 100, all the newspapers were calling him a traitor, right? He's betraying his own country. But actually, he had a different goal in his mind. The year after the Olympics, he went to China as a missionary. And when the Japanese came and took over China, his wife and kids went to Canada. He stayed, and he was put in an internment camp. And he spent all that time with many of the youth there. There were many youths and kids, and he would play games with them and just to keep them in good spirits. But before the end of the war, he had died. He had I think it's an inoperable brain tumor, right? Gladys Aylward. So she also lived during that time. She's I don't know if anyone's heard of her. So she was a maid in London. She was born in 1902, and she felt God had called her to be a missionary. She applied to the China Inland Mission, but they basically in the end rejected her because her Chinese was not good enough, right? So she didn't have any support. So she took all her savings as a maid, bought a train ticket from London all the way to China, eventually to China, through Siberia, and then took a boat from Japan to get to China. There are many amazing stories about her, so if you don't know about her, you can look her up. But one of the most amazing stories is that during the time the Japanese invaded her town, she led 100 kids. So if you guys can think of you taking a drive with your kids, those are you, her parents, from Houston to Dallas, right? That's kind of a long trip, about 400, not quite, about 400 kilometers. She took 100 kids and walked most of the way, but took a trip, a 400-kilometer trip, and walked with them for 40 days to get to Xi'an to escape the invasion. So she eventually returned to the UK, but she, after 10 years, she wanted to return to China, but she was not allowed to return to China. So she went to Taiwan, where she opened orphanages and eventually died there. Okay. John Sung. So he was one of the most influential Chinese evangelists in the 1930s. He was born in 1901. He studied, he came to the US to study, actually. He went to Ohio State and got his PhD in chemistry. So at that time, that's a really big deal. But then he went to seminary, Union Theological Seminary, which is actually an interesting story because he wanted to give his life to Christ, but when he went to seminary, the teaching was very liberal, and he got into like Buddhism and Taoism, and he started to kind of wonder about his faith until one day he actually had an experience, like a spiritual experience, and he felt Jesus talking to him. He saw himself was covered in sin, and when he prayed, he felt Jesus telling him that he's forgiven. He was so transformed by this experience, he started sharing the gospel with everyone, but the school thought he was crazy and put him in an insane asylum. Right? So, but then he got on eventually he got out. He got on the boat. He threw away all his degrees into the ocean. He wanted to devote his life to God. So when he returned to China, he started spreading the gospel. He asked God to give him 10 years to share the gospel. It's said that he had 100,000 converts from his preaching. In 1945, he wasn't very old, like 45 years old. He died from intestinal TB. So during the war times, actually during the Japanese invasion times, many of the Chinese people moved to central parts of China to flee the fighting. And there were two German missionaries. There were single ladies that went to Sichuan areas. And so at that time, the Japanese were bombing all these cities. So that's a Japanese bomber. And then the picture below that, this side, is basically the city after the bombing. And those were like tunnels people dug to hide from the bombing shelters. And this side. These are my grandparents. Okay, so they actually were married while on the run from war, right? And how these two ladies relate to us is they were two missionaries. They really struggled to share the gospel. Nobody really wanted to listen to them. So they opened up women's clinics and helped deliver babies. And at that time, most of the Chinese women, there was like high mortality rate for women who were giving birth. And so they brought like scientific and hygienic delivery methods. So many Chinese women went to them. So my grandmother went to them. And in fact, my dad was delivered by them, and also my aunt. And when my aunt was born, they were struggling so much that actually they started taking care of my aunt all the way until she was 4 years old. And they shared the gospel with her. And they tried to share the gospel with my grandparents, but my grandparents really weren't interested. My grandmother said, I don't want to believe in a foreign religion, right? And my grandfather, who's an engineer, like, oh, well, I believe in science, right? So, but they sowed the seed of the gospel with my family. And my grandmother later became a Christian and led all her family to Christ. My grandfather had to wait another 50 years before he became a Christian. And so back to the timeline. After the Japanese were defeated in World War II, the Chinese Civil War resumed with the communists winning the war. So the communists basically took over all of China and drove the nationalists to Taiwan. And the nationalists were basically the most well-educated, the wealthy, and the upper-class elites. They were driven to Taiwan. And this began the closed communist China period. The communists believed that religion is the opiate of the masses, right? Karl Marx said something like that. And And they saw Christianity as a opportunity for foreign influence. So they really didn't want, so soon after taking the control, they didn't want Christianity to grow out of control. So they established what's called the Three Self-Patriotic Movement. It's an organization to oversee all of Christianity in China. And they also drove out all of the foreign missionaries, so no missionaries are allowed. And they started what's called also the Catholic Patriotic Association, which is interesting because if you're a Catholic, you answer to the Vatican, right? But in China, you can't. You answer to the Catholic Patriotic Association. So for a Catholic, you really can't be a Catholic in China because that's not real Catholicism. All the people who were not willing to join the Three Self-Patriotic Movement or the Catholic Patriotic Association were sent to labor camps or prison. Many of the leaders were sent there. And then in 1966 to 1977, you may have heard of the Cultural Revolution. Basically, this is a very crazy time in China where you can be, if you have anything that's like an old or traditional thing, you could be taken outside and beaten. All the books were burned, and during that period of time, all the churches were banned. Not even the Three Self Church was allowed to meet. So during this time, there was one of the most influential Chinese Christians was Watchman Nee. And he was born in 1903. He was saved in 1920 during a revival, and he was influenced a lot by the Plymouth Brethren, so a denomination. And he founded a local church, what's called the local church, and he has many books that are still in publication today. He was arrested in 1952 on charges of bribery and theft and government property, theft of government property and tax evasion. Basically, he was involved in a business, and the government accused him of all of these crimes. And his church refused to join the Three Self-Patriotic Movement. And as a result, he was thrown in prison. He was sentenced to 15 years of labor camp and died in prison in 1972. So when he died, under his pillow, there was a note. And that's what he wrote. Yeah. Okay, and then another very influential Chinese minister is Ming. He was born in 1900, and he started the home church, probably the biggest home church group in China. And he preached around the country, and all the denominations actually also invited him to preach there. When the Japanese came, the Japanese actually required all the churches to join a Japanese kind of organization that oversaw the churches. He refused, and they threatened to arrest him, but he wouldn't do it, but they never did anything to him. With the communists, he refused at first, and then he was arrested. And I don't know what happened when he was arrested, but he signed a confession and said, okay, I will join. But after that, when he was released, for 2 years, he was not the same person. He couldn't preach. He couldn't talk to people. He was like having a nervous breakdown. So in 1957, he and his wife went back to prison and said, we can't be part of the Three Self Church. We're gonna be, you can just arrest us. So he stayed in prison. And in 1979, when China was starting to open up and releasing a lot of the prisoners, he refused to be released. He said, I haven't changed my stance. You need to keep me in prison, right? And they had to trick him to release him. They said, we're renovating the prison, so we have to move. And when he left out, he's like, you're out already. So. Yeah. Okay, so modern China. So if any of you have problems with chopsticks, you recognize Richard Nixon. So Richard Nixon came to China in 1970s and kind of normalized the relationships with China. And the Three Self, after the Cultural Revolution and Mao Zedong died, the Three Self Church kind of started resuming, and many of the church leaders were released. And 1979, we normalized relationship with the U.S. and the West. And a lot of changes, right? In 1987, Amity Press was open to print Bibles in China. And so a lot of things were happening in the 80s. And some of you might remember Tiananmen Square in 1989. That's when many Chinese students were in Tiananmen Square to protest for democracy. And then the government came and cracked down on them, right? It's kind of a terrible story, but the other side of the story that you may not have heard is that many of those student democracy leaders that have escaped, they've become Christians, and many of them are pastors here in the U.S., right, or in the West. So, but China really kind of opened up, and in the 90s, many students came to the U.S. to study, and many of them became Christians while studying here in the U.S. through campus ministry. And as the Chinese economy is growing, many of them have returned back to China. And so here's a graph of basically the Christian population in China. So the Three Self Church says they have 20 to 30 million baptized Christians, and the home church, basically the underground church, there's estimates, conservative estimates of over 70 million. So altogether 100 million, right? Some say that's more than the number of Communist Party members in China. And so despite the rapid growth of Christianity in China, there's still many challenges and problems. So the fundamentals have not changed. Missionaries are still not allowed in China. So people who tell you that they're going to China for missions, that's not what they have on their visa, right? So many have gone to China as English teachers or other tent makers, right? And there's still no allowed gathering outside of the Three Self Patriotic Movement Church. It's illegal to preach the gospel to anyone younger than 18. So if you think about that, what does that mean? There's absolutely no children's ministry in China. You're not allowed to, right? It's illegal. The Bible can only be purchased at the Three Self Church with registration. So you have to put your name down. I'm buying a Bible, right? Sometimes these rules are loosely enforced, and sometimes they can become very strict, and that can change any moment. So for the last maybe 10 years, you can buy actually a Bible online, right? But suddenly, last year, all Bible sales online have been stopped. In fact, the latest administration is very anti-Christian. In the last few years, thousands of crosses that are on top of churches have been removed. Many churches have been demolished, and even in the last few weeks, we're hearing news of many church leaders, home church leaders, being arrested. So the other challenges are that these home churches, some of them are very isolated and they're susceptible to cult teachings. So there are a lot of cults in China because you can go to a village and say, have you heard this? No? Let me tell you about this thing about the Bible that you didn't understand before. So it's very easy for cults to grow in China. And within the Three Self Church, you may come on Sunday and have a gathering, but that's it. There's no groups outside of that. So you can't have friends within the Three Self Church. All right, so, and China obviously is growing so rapidly financially that materialism is a big issue. So when I started, I asked you what you thought about China, and I think it's really important. I think the real important question is, what is God's perspective on China or on any part of the world? In my view, the Chinese history, there are many challenging things. In the last 200 years, the Chinese have really experienced profound suffering, and at the same time, Christianity has grown rapidly in spite of the persecution. Some say that the fertile soil of the gospel was watered by the blood of the martyrs. And one guy, his name Paul Hathaway, he wrote a book on Chinese martyrs. He said that in China, 250,000 people have martyred for their belief. And in the 100 years between 1900 to 2000, more people have been martyred in China than all the other countries combined in the world. For me personally, I can tell you that God used those two German ladies, missionaries, to bring His love and the gospel to my family, right? And if you think about it, they're Germans. Their country was at war. In fact, an enemy of the Chinese country, right? And they came to China to share the gospel to my family. So I think it's a good thing to look in your history too, and how your family became Christian, and how God touched your family, and what sacrifices were made so that you have the gospel. Okay, that's my presentation. Sorry I ran over time.